V1, rotate, so holding it straight with the rudder. Now, putting back on that side stick, just holding that rudder where I put it, keep pulling back, keep looking out to get that nose off the ground, keep that rudder in, and away we go. Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we are going to take a look at a big topic and something that's been much requested ever since I started this YouTube channel actually, which is engine failures on takeoff. How do we handle them as pilots? What does the aircraft do, and what the sort of things are required of us to make sure that it all comes out as a safe result. What I'm talking about here, of course, is engine failures just after V1. So V1 is the speed at which we have to continue the takeoff, even if there is an engine failure. So obviously the most critical point to lose half of your power is exactly at V1, because then you no longer have a chance to stop the takeoff on the runway. You now have to continue that takeoff into the air. So what happens if that engine fails just as we are past that point, and we now need to get ourselves airborne on one engine? Modern airliners are certified to do this. Pilots are trained, and every airline pilot will have done lots of these in the simulator. So it is something that they are trained to be ready for, because it's so critical. It's such an important safety aspect of modern airliner aviation. We are here in the Toliss A321. I currently have fitted the IAE engines, although it doesn't matter if you're using a Neo or a 320, the principles here are all the same. But the Toliss not long ago had an update to improve the single engine handling of it, which is why I want to use it. It also has an excellent fault scenario editor where we could make it happen. I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but of course none of this is for any real-world use. It's just for our use in home simulators to give you some extra context. We are here at Heathrow, taking off from runway 09 right in our 320 Sim Pilot Manta livery aircraft. So let's get started. Right, of course this tutorial is for people who already understand the basic principles of a takeoff in the Airbus. I have tutorials on that on my channel, both in Microsoft Flight Simulator and X-Plane. As I said, the principles we're going to see today can be applied to either of the simulators. Obviously the Microsoft Flight Simulator 320 Neo does not yet have the ability to add failures as and when you please, but I'm sure these things could be added in the future. So we are ready to go. A flap 1 takeoff today in our 321 with a flex of 40, so you know, a reasonably heavy 78-ton takeoff. Doesn't really matter as long as you're within your performance limits. Important to have your trim set correctly as well. If you haven't done that, make sure you go to the fuel prediction page in your MCDU, and you'll see your gross weight GW and your CG. So your gross weight CG is 30.1. So make sure you go over to your trimmer and set 30.1 in there. Okay, if that's done, we are now going to set up the failure. The Toliss has an excellent system here. As I said, this could become applicable to other simulators when they are added. But as you can see, I've gone to... let me reset these all actually. Okay, so add a new fault. And we're going to add... I'm going to scroll down to engine. And I'm going to have an engine one. Let's start with the flameouts. Now there are differences here. And a fire will not necessarily reduce the thrust on the engine. It's possible to have an engine fire with an engine that does full thrust. So it's not really what we're looking for. So we're looking for an engine to flame out, to turn off. There are various forms of this. A flameout is not as bad as a full-on failure with damage, which could involve the engine seizing instantly, things like that. But we'll go with the flameout as it's what we have. Next, we have the option to choose the criteria for it. So we'll go for at a speed, IAS, indicated airspeed. Now I'm going to go to here and go to my V1, which is 142. So it needs to be after 142. I can't select exactly 142, so I'm going to select 143. So this is how we train it in the simulators. You will actually, in the simulator, you'll select it at exactly V1 to make sure it happens at the exact moment that it's most critical. So there we go. So that is set. Right, so the aircraft has a failure ready to go, and we are ready to take off. So let's talk about what we're expecting to happen here. As I said, the aircraft is totally capable of taking off on a single engine, and we're about to prove that. So what are some things we need to do? Well, just like a normal takeoff, I need to take off looking down here at the end of the runway. I need to not focus down here or inside the aircraft too much. So to help me with that, I'm going to bring the PFD up big so I can see it. Because in simulators, or home simulators, it's a little bit tricky to keep it all in your viewpoint. But you're mainly looking out down here, and that way you can judge if the aircraft is going left or right. Crucially, the problem we have today is that our V1 would normally be called out by the other pilot, but we don't have that, so we need to be careful. But we're going to just carry on the takeoff, looking for V1 up here. As we pass V1, we can expect the engine to fail, so what are we going to need to do? Well, I'm going to need to put in a rudder to keep the airplane straight by looking at the end of the runway. I know that if I'm going left or right, so if you can see that, obviously I've got full pedal deflection. Now, I haven't done this video before because I've never had pedals, but I do now have rudder pedals at home, which makes a big difference to being able to control the aircraft laterally. So it's important that you have your pedals set up properly and that you can get full rudder deflection with your pedals. As you can see there, my rudder is fully moving, so that is good. So I'm going to look out and I'm just going to put in that rudder as required, and it will be quite a lot. Expect it to be a lot of rudder. It won't be full rudder, most likely, but it'll be whatever you need to keep yourself straight. Then you're waiting for the rotate call. So we've passed V1, we have to carry on, so we keep our airplane straight on the runway. When we reach rotate, today that is 150 knots, then I can pull back on the side stick as normal and rotate the aircraft up off the ground. The trick here is do not focus inside on your screen, focus outside. Make sure that you keep that runway visible and you keep yourself straight on the center line. Most likely what will happen is when the engine fails, you'll have to put in some rudder, for example like that or like that. Then you'll be rolling down the runway, then you'll rotate and you'll start to pull back on the side stick like this. What you want to do is once you start putting back on the side stick, once you start rotating the aircraft off the ground, you don't really need to be fiddling much with the rudder. You should probably have it pretty much held where it was to keep you on straight on the runway. Don't focus too much on it. Then you want to keep that rotation going, and as your pitch passes through 10 degrees, the aircraft will lift off the ground, most likely, if all is going well. As it lifts off the ground, you're going to then look inside and you'll see your speed reference system bar showing you where to pitch to. You want to gently move the aircraft to that. The idea on an engine failure on takeoff is to pitch towards 12.5 degrees, which is this line here. But you don't necessarily need to reach 12.5 degrees, you just need to be heading towards it. If you then get in the air, then you need to judge other parameters to make sure that they are all okay. So crucially, we get into the air as we pass through 10 degrees pitch, most likely, as I said. We're going towards 12.5 degrees, but then we can follow the SRS, the green bar. That green bar is going to target for us V2, which is 153 today. We need to climb away from the runway, no slower than V2, 153, and no leveling off or descending. We need to be either, the worst case is a level off, but ideally we want to be slightly climbing away the whole time. There are certain parameters and stages where that doesn't matter so much, but never descending, always slightly climbing away, and never slower than V2. So to recap, we're going to take off as normal, we're going to look out to the end of the runway to keep the airplane straight, we're going to use the rudder to keep it straight as required if the engine fails. As we pass through our rotate speed, we're going to pull back and hold that rudder wherever it was to try and keep the airplane roughly straight as we rotate off the ground. We're going to keep rotating until we get the pitch up through 10 degrees and we get into the air. Once we are in the air, we're going to move to that green SRS bar to keep our speed above V2 and our vertical speed at least slightly climbing, maybe worst case leveling off for a second. As soon as we are in the air, we want to get that gear up. If we miss the opportunity to bring the landing gear up, you'll get into a problem where the airplane won't climb, it will start descending, and you won't be able to bring the gear up because you won't have positive climb, and that is not what we want. So it's very important we don't forget the gear. In reality, these days, it would probably climb, but yeah, who knows. So let's give it a go. Okay, so the numbers, performance figures I'm going to use have changed slightly since what I just showed you. So to make it clear, here we go. We have the flap 1 takeoff. V1 is 149, VR is 149, V2 is 152, which are over here. Flex of 42, so put 42 in there. Now, if you look, this now means V1 and rotate are the same, but it doesn't change what we're going to do. We are going to look out to the end of the runway, we're going to keep the airplane straight using that rudder, and then at the same point, we can also start our rotation. Now, this is a long runway, which is why V1 and VR are the same, because we've got a lot of room to stop. So the reality is, for the purposes of this training exercise, as we learn this skill, we are going to focus on keeping the airplane straight, and then we are going to rotate. So separate the two because we have a long runway. Now, there are some places where you'll need to do them pretty simultaneously, but that's more advanced. That'll come later. Something else to note is that by default, the Toliss puts the engine out acceleration altitude at 490 feet. But I don't want that. I don't want to accelerate until I'm 1,000 feet above the ground. So I'm going to put in, as you can see, these are 1,500 feet. So I'm going to put in 1,090. I really wouldn't want to accelerate at 400 feet. Now, there are special cases where that may be the case, but rare. Most airlines will try and accelerate around about 1,000 feet above the ground. So make sure to change that. Otherwise, your SRS will change too early. So make sure you put in 1,090 in there, or whatever it is, 1,000 feet above your current altitude when you start this. And then there's our speeds and performance. Okay, let's get started. Of course, now I must make sure that my failure happens at the right point. So 149, there it is, engine 1 flame out 149. That is ready to go. So let's get into the air. So I'm going to hold it on the toe brakes, release the parking brake, start the timer, bring up the PFD. Okay, and we'll say takeoff. Half side stick forward. Bring up those engines, start spooling them up towards 50% N1 to stabilize. There they are. Release the brakes, and now 2 clicks forward. There's our MAN Flex 42 SRS runway auto thrust blue. Therefore it is armed, and now, a bit sensitive on the rudder there. Okay, keep it straight, looking out to the end of the runway, and get ourselves going. This is just a normal takeoff up to this point. Wind is slightly from the right, so I'm having to use a little bit of left rudder to keep us there. Passing through 80 to 100 knots, bring the side stick to neutral. Okay. So here it comes. Remember, we are going to get an engine failure as we pass that number 1 on the speed scale. At that point, I'm going to use the rudder to keep the airplane straight and then rotate. So there's V1, rotate. So holding it straight with the rudder. Now, putting back on that side stick, just holding that rudder where I put it. Keep pulling back, keep looking out to get that nose off the ground. Keep that rudder in, and away we go. Now, I've reached 12.5 degrees. I can see that's a bit high. The SRS is beneath me, so gently bringing the nose down back towards the SRS and now holding it there. And there we go. Positive climb, get that gear up, as you can see. Even delaying it to that point is a little bit late, because now as the gear travels we get drag from the gear doors and things like that moving, so we can see our sink rate start to increase. We are still gently climbing though, 100 feet per minute. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to follow the SID. I'm going to imagine that I want to go straight ahead, so I'm going to pull the heading for the simplicity of what I want to show you here. I'm also going to turn off the GPWS system, because in real life it has a database and it knows where the airports are, so it wouldn't get so upset. And here we are now climbing away. So I'm holding that rudder that you can see down there, and if I go to the flight control page, you can see I'm holding that rudder in myself using the pedals to keep it straight. How am I judging that rudder now? Now I'm in the air. So on the ground, I'm simply putting in enough rudder to keep the aeroplane straight along the runway. But in this case, I'm off the runway now, so how am I keeping it straight? I look at this, it's called the beta target, and as you can see, it's yellow normally, it's just a slip coordinator, so normally you would put rudder towards it. The Airbus has its own coordination, so you don't normally need to look at this, but when you have an engine failure, you need to use it for your rudder. Now you can see there, I'm talking and I've got slow, so the SRS has gone down, so I need to lower the nose gently to make sure that we keep that gentle rate of climb and get the speed back to V2. So there we go. So this beta target is different from the normal side slip indicator. What it does is it's targeting a slight side slip and compromise, because if we go outside the aircraft now, you'll actually see that we have several controls deflected. We have a bit of that these roll spoilers are slightly up on this side. I've got the rudder out. So this is a compromise. If we were to perfectly coordinate the aircraft and have wings level, we'd actually need more flight control deflection and it will create more drag. So that's why it changes to this blue beta target, it's called. It's a compromise between the two to give a more efficient climb on single engine. So it's clever stuff as ever. Now, if I was to let go of the rudder pedals, so you can see them down there, I'll just let go to neutral. Look at what happens. It goes way off to the right. And that is an uncoordinated aeroplane. Now it's safe and stable because, as ever, the Airbus is very clever and it's stabilized in its own way. So, yeah, it's not the end of the world. If you do nothing, you can see the aircraft will just gently climb away. Look at that on one engine. It's a remarkable machine. There's our wind-milling engine. So what I need to do, I'm just going to pull the speed because it's taking me a while. There we go. I'm going to put it at 149. So this is the same situation we've been in. And what I'm going to do is apply that rudder, and I put more and more right rudder in until that blue beta target goes underneath the triangle, and then it is lined up. Get that nose down, keep us at V2. So there we go. So now it's lined up. Now once I've done this and I'm safely climbing away, and let me just put that heading to where we are, just for the sake of keeping it easy. So we're safely coming away. Once I've done that, and this will normally happen much lower down, obviously I'm just talking you through it, we now need to trim the rudder. So here's our rudder trim. Now I don't have the TCA add-on pack that lets me do this, so it's a bit awkward. But what you do in real aircraft is you'd run that trimmer to the same direction you've got your pedal. So I've got right rudder pedal pressed, so I'm going to run right trimmer. And as I do, you'll see that I can release that rudder pedal and that blue target stays in the middle. So what you do is you trim out the force just as you would in a normal aircraft. So I'm just trimming it, and now it's again hard in the simulator because we don't have force feedback. In the real aircraft, your weight would be on those pedals. And there we go. Now my feet are a bit more needed, a little bit more rudder. There we go. Quite a lot of trim needed. It's quite typical, getting a bit slow. So let's get that nose down. As I said, this is not a textbook example of it. This is just to show you guys all the different steps of the process. So you can see there, if you get slow, you can get yourself into problems. Look, we've leveled off pretty much. Not ideal. Because we now got to try and get that energy back to V2. So you really don't want to get yourself into this situation. So we'll keep that nose down. There we go. We are nice and high now, so we are pretty safe anyway. We're well away from the ground. But you can see, there we go. Right, so we've got the rudder in, and now no autopilot, and the rudder is just holding itself, and I'm putting no force in myself, but there you go. You can see the trimmer and the rudder is set over there. So that's great, and now the airplane is flying away. I've got no hand on any of the controls. It's just doing its job. So amazing stuff, really. Great, so what is next? Well, you can actually put in an autopilot at this point. So autopilot 1, once you've trimmed out that rudder, the autopilot is available. So there we go, autopilot 1. And the airplane will now take over the rudder trim as well. It can handle all of these things. So now it will do its job to fly to these points. I'm not sure why it's done that. I wouldn't expect that to happen. There we go, it suddenly increased the VLS. Not sure why that seems a bit of a bug. Right, so let's go and do that again in slow time and just talk through those steps. So here we are taking off from the outside, and let's see what happens. Remember, we were looking out to keep the airplane straight on that centre line. There's the engine failure there. It's a bit of a swing, which is normal, but we keep ourselves on the centre line by looking out, and now we rotate. We keep putting back, and you can see the temptation to hover, but if you keep putting back, you'll get cleanly in the air. As we get into the air, that engine now has spooled down, and the airplane is going to obviously weathercock into wind like that. And really, you want the gear coming up by now. It was slow on the gear on this one as I was talking through it, but there's the gear coming up, and we got away with it. Now, an important point to note here is that we are crossing over the other end, the threshold at the other end of the runway. Aircraft are certified to do this at the screen height, which does depend. It can be really low, but it's supposed to be at least 30 feet, and it can be lower in wet conditions and so on. But as you can see, we actually passed the threshold, because this is a short-haul aircraft on a long-haul runway, really. We're 200 feet above it, 210 feet on the rad-out. So that's plenty of performance. It shows how much extra room we had because of this nice long runway. And there we go. We are climbing away. We've got that drift on. We've got one engine. And as you can see, we've got flight controls working hard. Got that right rudder in. Let's put it back down on the ground then, and I'll show you how the rudder was applied. It's just a case of putting it in as much as you need to keep the airplane straight. So here we go, rolling along. You can see our rudder up here. There it goes. There, holding right, rotating, holding that rudder now. As you rotate, you're focusing on getting into the air, and then now once I'm in the air, I can correct the pitch and then start fine-tuning the rudder. What's important to note is that we're not in a rush to account or make this blue beta target perfect. We want it roughly in the middle, but it's more important we stay straight on the runway when we're on the ground, and then as we get into the air, we want to make sure we get the pitch right. So the pitch here is good. We've got a bit of climb. We're just about at V2. We don't want to go any slower. So this is fine. There's no point, if that was slightly off to one side, the beta target was off to one side, we're not going to worry about that. We are focused on this pitch and getting the aircraft climbing safely away by this point. A slight lack of coordination would not be an issue here. And there we go. We got ourselves cleanly away, notably lower than a normal departure. Let's go and do that again then, just to get more exposure to it. So now let's do a flap 3 takeoff. So let's do flap 3 on the active flight plan. This gives us slightly lower speeds, 136, 136, and 139. It gives us a flex temperature of 36, so slightly higher power. So what's different about this? Well, the same. We applied the same routine to that initial clearing from the ground. We'll talk about the cleanup later on. So for this one, I'm going to be higher thrust, we have a lower flex temperature. So that might need more rudder because there's more thrust coming from the live engine. Then we also have this lower speed, so the flight controls could be slightly less effective. There's less airflow over the rudder as we apply it and so on. So this is a slightly more challenging scenario, a heavyweight flap 3 takeoff. The flap 1 is preferable. We have more air. It's a bit nicer to control. Most pilots prefer it. But there we go. So we've got our engine out acceleration nice and high. We've got more thrust and a flap 3 takeoff. The speeds at V1 and rotate are still the same at 136, so that's no problem there. Okay, let's get ourselves underway. So let me set up the failure. Fault scenarios, add new fault. Now, when you practice these or when you are trained on these in the aircraft, you won't get told which failure you're going to get. So it's which engine it could be. It could be either side. There we go, 136. So that is set up. We are ready to go. So holding it on the toe brakes, release the parking brake, start the timer, spool up to 50% N1, and we'll give it another go. As I said, could need a bit more rudder, and we're going to fail the other engine this time. Release the brakes, 2 clicks forwards, and half side stick down, of course. Just zoom out a bit. It does help, I think, to have a bit of a wider field of view if you can, just to judge the swinging of the aircraft. And away we go. So 80 to 100 knots, side stick to neutral, and we're going to do exactly the same thing again. Just keep it straight by looking out. It doesn't matter which way the airplane goes, we're just going to look out to the end and apply the rudder that we are required to apply. There's V1. It's going to the right, so I'm going to put left rudder in, and now I can start my rotation. So pulling back, holding that rudder now, because I just want to get into the air. Oh, a bit left rudder needed, I think. A bit more left, and we're climbing away. I've reached 10 degrees. I think I don't want to go any higher, because I can see I'm at V2. SRS doesn't seem to be too helpful. So I'm going to gently bring that nose now to SRS. I don't want to dive down towards it or level off. Positive climb, get that gear up.
Too low, terrain.
Okay, now we're in the air. Let's squeeze on a bit more left rudder. I need a bit more. Keep going, keep going. There we go. Get that blue target more towards the center.
Too low, terrain.
And now I've got the target centered. I'm climbing. I'm at V2. Again, that GPWS thing is a glitch in this simulator. We wouldn't have to turn it off in real life. And we can follow nav. I'm surprised. I don't think it would bank this much, actually. I think that's a bit unrealistic. The real aircraft limits its bank when you're this slow. But you can follow your SID. Usually they should be designed for single engine performance. If they aren't, you'll have an emergency procedure. Here we go then, climbing away. Flap 3, all the same. So now I would put the rudder trim in. So I'm using left rudder this time. So I'm going to hold that to the left. Getting slow there. Keep that nose. Got to be very careful not to take your eye off it. And so obviously this is much easier in the real aircraft where you have a rudder trim switch. And it would be a nice thing if I could get hold of one of those add-on packs for the Thrustmaster TCA. Keep applying that rudder. Keep getting that trim in. Now bring it to the left. Yeah, to have a rudder trim switch is it's a really critical part of the aeroplane. That's why it's so big, and it's quite unique in the aircraft. It stands out. Get that autopilot in, and we are climbing away. Now the autopilot is taking over the control of the rudder, so it will start applying more rudder trim. As you can see, there wasn't quite enough in there. I did accelerate it. Master caution, we got that engine failure. We don't need to do anything below 400 feet except cancel the warning, and on positive climb we're going to raise the gear. We're through 400 feet now, so we can start securing that engine. So let's check what we've got. We've got engine 2 fail. Yeah, engine 2 failed. It's on the right, and I've got caution lights on the number 2 engine. You'd also expect probably a bleed caution light and a hydraulic caution light on the engine pump. But there we go. So we're going to follow these actions. Engine 2 fail. Engine mode selected to ignition. It goes to ignition. Thrust lever 2 to idle. Number 2 would be confirmed by the other pilot as well. Goes to idle. Now there's no relights because we know it's failed, and it's been 30 seconds since it all went wrong. Just going to pull the speed. It shouldn't actually accelerate like this until you're ready for it to. But there we go. So Manflex 36. It goes into climb mode. But anyway, we're going to keep it at 139. Just for argument's sake while we do this exercise. Okay, so we've idled the engine as per the ECAM, and now it wants Engine Master 2 off because it's been 30 seconds, and that's 30 seconds from when the engine failed. FADEC's been trying to relight it for that whole time, and it hasn't worked. So it's been more than 30 seconds. Engine Master 2 off. Again, you would confirm this, so that can go off if damaged. Is the engine damaged? Well, we know we flamed it out because that's the fault we gave it. we can see actually that N1 is spinning, N2 is spinning, the EGT is just cooling down, there's no fuel flow. So actually, without any bang, no fire warning or anything like that, I could quite comfortably say it's probably okay. It's just flamed out for some reason. So I'd say there's no damage. If there was damage, we would push one of these buttons. We'll talk about that later on. If no damage, consider it a relight. Okay, but anyway, now we've turned off the master switch, the engine is secured. So there we go, the master switch is off. So once we do that, we can say stop ECAM. We don't want to do any more of this. I need to accelerate and get rid of those flaps because eventually we're going to run out of spare performance here. So push to level off, vertical speed to 0, and then those will come down. Now I'm going to go to manage speed, and it's going to accelerate to 250 knots. And now you'll remember this from a normal takeoff. We're going to get above F, bring the flaps from 3 to 1. If we'd taken off flap 2, we'd get above F and bring them from 2 to 1. So nothing too exciting there. We're following this green line, so in real life we would tell air traffic that we're not going to be able to make these restrictions. You can see we're supposed to be above 3,000 feet here. We're not going to make that, obviously, so we would tell them. But otherwise, there's no terrain issues for us. We're quite safe here. Now, it is slow to accelerate. It is very slow to accelerate. Now, if you had taken off and you were struggling to accelerate away from the ground, or you thought that it wasn't climbing as safely as you would like it to, you do have the option to just go to toga. Remember, we've used a flex takeoff. But if I was to go to toga now, the airplane would actually go back into SRS because we've got some flap out, so it would think it's doing a go around. So I don't want to do that now. It'd make my life more difficult. There we go. We're above the green F, so flaps can come from 3 to 2 to 1. And now we're getting rid of a lot of that drag so that we can start to accelerate. As you can see, not perfectly wings level. There's a bit of a side slip. It's all fine, but that's just how the Airbus wants to be. It's coordinated, or should be coordinated, according to this blue target. So as you saw there then, to deal with the ECAM, you do actually stop when the engine is pretty much secured. Now this is a big topic, and I don't want to spend... This video could go on for hours if I start talking about all of the failure options and how we judge it and so on. So in the case of an engine that's flamed out like this, we turn off the master switch, and once the master switch is off following the ECAM, we saw that there's no damage, so that's when we can stop doing the ECAM and carry on with flying the aeroplane and getting rid of this the flaps. So we're zooming along. Remember, this was heavy, so this is a nasty scenario to get, really, which is why the performance is quite as slow as it is. I'm a little surprised by how winged down it is as well. I don't think the real aircraft will be quite that severe. There we go, we're above the green S, flaps to 0. Then once that trend arrow reaches the green dot, I'm going to pull for open climb. And in the real aircraft, the target speed would change actually. It would go from 250, it would actually be green dot by this point. So I'm going to pull green dot. So we're in a green dot open climb now, which is the cleanest, most efficient, quickest climb we can get in the aircraft, and it's flashing lever MCT. Now, how do we do that? Because we put them into flex MCT for takeoff because we didn't use full thrust at toga. So how are we going to get rid of that? Well, what we do is we bring it back to climb and then up to MCT again, and now it says thrust MCT. Remember, your FMAs up here are the most important part. So thrust MCT, open climb, auto thrust. And now look at that rate of climb, 1,000 feet per minute. The wings are level. You'll notice our little beta target has gone. That's because we are now in a different situation. We haven't got the, we're not climbing up from the grounds and so on. But yeah, look at that. Much happier aeroplane. We've got more airflow. We've got the drag out of the way, and we're climbing away. And now we can carry on with the ECAM as per my other my other failure tutorial videos where we would run through these, consider relighting and so on, and then you've got your status page. Something you'll notice on the status page is that we are still Cat 3 single. The aeroplane in this situation could return and auto land in fog down to 200 meters visibility, and it will land itself on one engine. Isn't that amazing? It is such a capable aeroplane. So here we go, here's that takeoff now, and there's the engine failure with the swing. This is a replay obviously, and then we get our rotation. Still staying roughly on the centre line, weathercocking slightly into the wind, which was from the right. And up we go. Not quite as precise on the rudder for this one, but as you can see, if you make big control deflections, you start to get more drag, because look, these spoilers are having to come up and so on. So you want to be relatively gentle on the controls, but with the rudder, you've just got to get enough rudder in to deal with the failure. What you can't do is obviously go off the side. So let's view that again at the point of failure, which is somewhere here. So a little bit of left rudder is already being used because of the wind, trying to make the aeroplane weathercock. There it is, and then get that rudder in, keep it straight. There are videos out there of aircraft that have had engine failures on takeoff, and you see the rudder, and you just have to get the rudder in, keep it on that runway, and up we go. So you've got lots of flap out, lots more drag, but the performance works. The flex takeoff figures work. It's all there. So yeah, it's all set up for this exact scenario. It's all certified to be working in this case. Here's the view in the cabin. Would you know in the cabin if there's been an engine failure on takeoff? You'd probably feel the swing or hear the noise of the engine spooling down, but I really don't know how many there have been. But a simple engine flame out like this is not a huge issue for the aircraft. And here you go, looking out the window. You might sense a slightly slower than normal climb. Maybe a bit of swinging around, I don't know. But yeah, it might not feel much worse than a turbulent sort of takeoff on a windy day, to be honest with you, because the aircraft can do it. And here you go, we're just climbing away a little bit more gently than you would on a 2-engine takeoff. As we said, we've lost half the thrust we expected to have, but the performance figures all account for that. And away we go. So let's recap what we've done so far. On takeoff, if we have an engine failure after V1, we have to continue the takeoff. So what we do is we continue to look out to the end of the runway to keep the airplane straight using the rudder. At rotate, which may or may not be at the same time as V1, we're going to rotate the aircraft, putting back as per normal, but looking outside to make sure we continuously keep the nose coming up. We don't want to hesitate. We want that nose to continuously come up. It can be a little bit slower than a normal rotation, slightly slower than the 3 degrees a second. But as long as you just keep it smooth, and as we've seen earlier, just looking out and continuous, you'll get cleanly off the runway. Whilst we're doing that, we're going to need to keep that rudder in to keep the airplane straight. As we pitch up, we don't want to go higher than 12.5 degrees. If we reach 12.5 degrees, that's fine, but then we need to move to the SRS. If we don't reach 12.5 degrees and we're in the air, that's also fine, as long as we then move to the SRS once we are in the air. Once we're climbing away, we want to get the landing gear up. So as soon as we have positive climb, gear needs to come up because it's producing a lot of drag. Below 400 feet, we focus on flying the airplane. So we continue with our rudder and our pitch to make sure we climb, no slower than V2, and we don't want to descend. We can cancel any master warnings, but otherwise we don't do any of the ECAM, we're just focused on flying. Once we have the airplane under control, we center the beta target. We use the rudder, as we saw earlier, to align the blue bottom half of that triangle. Once that's done, we can trim it and put in the autopilot. If you find the trimming difficult, in the flight simulator, you may just put in the autopilot. In real life, we wouldn't do that because there'll be a big swing because the airplane will be uncoordinated until the autopilot puts it in. Then you can carry on with your ECAM once you're above 400 feet until you've turned off that engine master switch, at which point you're going to focus on flying up to your engine out acceleration altitude 1,000 feet above where you took off normally, at which point you'll push the level off, accelerate, retract those flaps and go into a green dot climb. Once you've done that, it'll say lever MCT, and you bring the thrust levers to MCT, either by bringing them back to climb and then back forwards to MCT, or if you took off at toga, you just bring them back one step to MCT. Finally then, let's look at something that's quite interesting, which is an engine failure that happens shortly after we get into the air. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off, and I'm going to have an engine failure at a couple of 100 feet without the autopilot in, and I'm going to not do anything. This is not what the real pilots would do. I just want to show you how stable the aircraft is and why we don't need to rush into anything in the Airbus. So we are set up for a flap 1. We are back to our heavyweight takeoff, 76 tons out of Heathrow. Let us set up a failure. Add fault. Let's give ourselves a good old engine failure. And let's do this one at an altitude. I'm not sure if this altitude is above sea level or not. So let's put it at 400 feet. That'll work nicely. Okay, so now we're going to do our normal takeoff just as we have been. So holding on the brakes, release the parking brake, start the timer, Support up those engines. Engine fires is a different topic, and we'll cover those in another video. This is just to show you that point of failure at rotate, to show you how we handle it. Release the brakes, 2 clicks forward, man flex, 42 SRS runway. Auto thrust is blue and armed, and away we go. So I'm going to take off as per normal, and then I'm going to let go of the controls, and we'll see what the Airbus does when an engine fails. And remember, this will be a takeoff thrust in flight. So you'd think very serious. And it is very serious, but we'll see just how clever the Airbus system is. The Airbus has a yaw damper. Now, this is used for various things, but one thing it can do is stop the airplane swinging to the side. It can sense the engine failure and the swing. So there's V1 and rotate. Let's get ourselves into the air. Positive climb. Gears coming up. There's nav, and we're getting those warnings again. Let me bring up that PFD view. Right, I'm going to let go of everything now. So just put it on the flight directors. Leave it there. Okay, and there's the engine failure. I'm not touching anything. I'm not touching the rudder. It's all at neutral. There's our engine failure on the ECAM, and look what happens to the airplane. Speed starts to wash off, so I'm going to push the nose down now. Push the nose down to that SRS. There we go. See the yaw? So we have a bit of yaw, we have a bit of wing down, about 5 degrees, which is about what you would expect. So this is great modelling by Toliss. But there it is. That's with no input. I put no rudder in. The airplane is safely climbing away on that single engine without any intervention. It's amazing. It's a really clever system. Now, of course, this isn't ideal. We're below V2, so this wouldn't pass a test or anything like that, but it's safe. So there we go. There is some engine failures on takeoff. It's a huge topic, one that we will have to cover many times over, to cover all the different scenarios. But I wanted to give you your first taste of how the aircraft handles and the sort of things we are doing when we train for this situation. As you can see, the aircraft is very capable of achieving its climb out on one engine, as we are doing right now. And even at very heavy weights, that is achievable. The performance figures are designed to make sure that this is the case. Pilots are trained for this regularly every year at least, but most likely every 6 months they will go into a simulator and have a go and prove that this is something that they can handle any day. It's also something we brief almost every day when we go and fly, just to be ready for this situation, because obviously it's such a critical point. But as you can see, entirely achievable. As ever, there'll be more tutorials in both X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Simulator coming to the channel soon, so do please subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content, as well as more live streams where we're going to fly our Airbuses around Europe and the world. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again in another video or live stream soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.